In this video, we'll show you how to manually create vectors for a fluted and spiral layout. We'll also discuss how to wrap clipart around a column. So to get started, we're going to have to create a new job. So let's just go ahead and do that. We're going to start off by choosing our job setup to be a rotary job. Okay, so the length of our job is going to be 18 inches and our diameter is going to be 2.5 inches. We're working in inches. We're going to zero off our cylinder's axis, which is probably the most accurate way we can do it for our machine. We are going to make sure our datum is set to the bottom left corner, and we're going to wrap our y-axis around our job. So we're going to move along up and down along our x-axis, and we don't need to flip the design. And we're going to choose a very high modeling resolution, and we are going to use an appearance of Canadian maple. And we're going to click OK. Now in this job, we're going to refer to fluting and spirals on a wrap job. And if you have vcarve Pro or Aspire, you have some gadgets that are built in that you can use to help you with that. But in this demonstration, we're going to show you how to do all of that by hand, step by step. So the first thing we're going to do is divide up our column into sections. We're going to need some sections to do different things in it. And to help us to set those up, we're going to use some guidelines. And some of the easiest ways to create guidelines are just to drag them in from your ruler. So if you left click on a ruler and drag down, you'll get a horizontal guideline. And then you can right click on it and delete that. And if you want to drag from the left, you can do that as well, and you'll get a vertical guideline. And again, you can right click on that and delete that. So we're going to use that tool to drop in our first guideline, and then we're going to use some other options to actually space out the rest of our guides. So we're going to drag in one from our left, and we're going to put it at about 0.5. So as soon as we see 0.5 showing up just below our cursor, we're going to let go. So that's our first guideline. Now, if we right click on that, we'll have our guide properties. Of course, it tells us about the guideline and where that one is currently, but also we can go and create some new guidelines. So we're going to create some guidelines relative to the selected guideline. In this case, it's this first one. We're going to create one of them. When we create the new guideline, we want our software to select that for us. And then we can type in the distance that we want between those two guidelines. So for our second guideline, we're going to put in 0.5 of an inch. And then we're going to go ahead and create a new guide. And you'll see that it appeared right there. And from there, we want to put in one at 5 inches from there. So we'll create a new guide. And then we're going to put another one in at 0.5 and create another guide. And then we're going to put one in at 2 inches. Create a guide, and then at 1 inch, we'll create a guide, and then at 7 inches, we'll create a guide, and for our last one, we just need to move 1 inch, and we'll create a new guide, and then we'll close that down. Now this has divided our job space up into some sections for us. So the distance between this corner and the top corner is actually the circumference around the surface of our cylinder right now. So that's good to know, and we're going to need that information in a little bit. This first line and this last line we're going to use to make tabs to hold our cylinder in place so it won't fall off our CNC machine, and also make it easier for us to actually cut it off the cylinder when we're all done. This guideline here and this guideline here, we're going to create coves with those. We're going to use these two guidelines to position a 3D model in here, and then between here and here, we're actually going to create a spiral piece of design. So when we set up our job, we were given some extra vector layers to work with. So let's go have a look at those and see what they are. So if we use our layer manager here, we'll see we have a 0 plane, which we need to keep that. We have a layer 1, which we need to keep. And every time you create a rotary job, you're going to get a bounding box. So we don't need that bounding box. So we're going to go ahead and right click on that and delete it. And we're going to delete all the data that's on that because we don't need any of that. We'll click OK. We're going to go back up to our layers menu, and we are going to rename layer 1 to tabs. So we're going to right click on that. We're going to say rename, and we'll type in tabs. And this layer is going to house the vectors for our tabs. And we're going to create some profile cuts later that when those profile cuts are done, we'll have a tab that'll hold our column in place. So let's go over here to our draw a polyline, and we're going to draw a polyline here, down to here. And then we're going to press the space bar, and we're going to do the same over here, down to there, and we'll press the space bar. That's great. So we can close that down. Now, if we ever need to hide our guides because they're maybe blocking something that we want to see, we just need to click up here in the corner. We can hide them, and we can turn them back on again. So when you hide them, you can see we have those two vectors for our tabs. So that's perfect. Now we're going to need a couple vectors for our coves. So we may as well go up and sort of to keep everything organized. We're going to create a brand new layer, and we're going to call that coves. And we're going to make sure that it is selected. Oh, we created an extra layer there. Let's just delete that extra layer there for now. And so we make sure we have coves selected, and that way our vectors will go on the right layer. So let's select our vector. And again, we're going to drop one more vector here to there, spacebar, and then from here to there, and another spacebar. Let's close that down now. So that's our cove vectors. And again, let's hide our guides, and that looks great. Now in this section right here, we want to create some vectors for our fluting. Now again, if you have vcarve Pro or Aspire, up in your gadgets menu under wrapping, you'll see that you actually have a fluting and a spiral gadget there to help you out, but we're going to show you how to do it from scratch. So I want to create a line that I'm going to copy in this area. That's the right length I need to make my flutes. So I'm going to go over here to my draw a line, and I'm going to snap here, and I'm going to move over, make my line 4 inches long. So I'm just looking at the length. And when I hit 4, I'm going to stop, and I'm going to click and press the space bar and close this down. Now I have a line that's 4 inches long. Now the space between these two vectors is 5 inches. So that means I'm going to have a 1/2 inch on each end once I get them all centered in there. So now I need to copy this to make sure that we have the right amount of flutes, or the right distance between the flutes. I'm really not bothered by how many flutes I have, but the distance between them is important. So if I select that vector, and I'm going to use this vector right here as a helper vector. So we're going to hold down my shift key and select that. And we're going to use copy along vectors. So I'm going to copy that object, a specific distance between the copies. That's how I'm going to define how many I have. So I want a minimum of 1.5 inches, and I'm going to force it to be even spacing. So what it's going to do is going to average out that distance so that each one is even, but I have at least 1.5 inches between them. And we're going to create my copies on a new layer, and we're going to click copy. So what the software done again is made sure that there was at least 1.5 inches between, and we can check that out if you want to, just by going to the measure tool. And if we click here to there, you'll see that the distance is right there. It's 1.57. So if I click from here to there, it's 1.57. So they're all evenly spaced, but there's slightly more space between them than the 1.5 inches, which is fine. So if we take a look at these, knowing that this dimension is our circumference and it's going to be wrapped around, then we have one extra line than we need. If we use these to flute with, then we'd actually flute the top line and the bottom line, and we just double up on it, and that wouldn't be what we want, and it'd be a waste of machining time. So let's select that. So let's select that, and we're going to delete that bottom one. Now, when I had actually made the copies, I had it create a brand new layer for us, but it just named it layer 1. So just keep everything nice and neat and tidy. Let's go up to our layers menu and right click on layer 1, and we're going to rename that flutes and press enter. There we are. Now let's select these 5 flutes by creating a selection box from the bottom right to the upper left. And when I do that, any objects that are inside of that or touch inside of that will be selected. So I have all those selected, right click, and I'm going to group those. Now we still have the original vector that we created up top to copy. So let's just go ahead and delete that because we don't need that anymore. Now we're going to use this line again to help us center these flutes in this area here. So if we select the flutes and hold down our Shift key and select the line, we can use our Align Selected Objects. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to align it up and down. Perfect. And then we're going to use the inside edge. So if I click that, everything will slide over so that all of these ends of those lines touch that line. And that's perfect. Now, like we had mentioned before, this distance here is 1 inch. So we want to move these over a ½ an inch. So if we just select those vectors and we use our Move Selected Objects, we can do a relative move in our X direction, 0.5 an inch, and we'll click Apply and close that. And there we have our lines all set up for our fluting. Okay, for the next bit of our layout, we're going to need to see our guides. So let's turn those back on again. And then let's press F on our keyboard to focus the view onto all of our job space. And we're going to put in a 3D component in this section right here that will wrap all the way around our cylinder. So to do that, we're going to go to our Modeling tab, and we are going to import in a shell molding. Now that's going to be found in your tutorials folder in your Rotary Machining Creating a Column folder. And we'll open that up. And it will end up being down here in the corner. Now you'll also get this little nudge from the software to say, this is the first component that you're adding into your project. The modeling plane of your job needs to be adjusted to avoid any kind of distortion. And so typically we would say yes here. That way we would avoid the distortion that we don't want to get in our model. So let's just go ahead and click yes. And then what we're going to do is, just to kind of keep everything nice and neat and tidy, we're going to create a brand new layer. We're going to call this Components. And we're going to go ahead and move this component to that layer. So we're going to right click on that and we're going to say Move to Layer Components. Now it's pretty tiny, so we need to actually get this thing sized up so that it will wrap around our column okay. So with that selected, what we're going to do is go to our Drawing tab and then set the selected object size. Now in this case, we're going to go ahead and just going to size it from the center. We're going to make the width of this equal to the Y dimension that we have, so the circumference of our cylinder. So if we just type in Y in there, and we have our link X and Y together, so it's going to automatically adjust our height and also our scale, our Z scale. And if we press equals and then apply, we'll see that our model has been sized up to the correct size. So let's just click close, and let's move that to the middle of our job here so we can better see it. Now to rotate it, we can just press 9 on our keyboard twice, and then we're actually going to grab it from the corner here and we're going to fit it in to that. And we're just going to make sure that we get it as close as we can to that area. That looks good. So let's have a look at our 3D view now. And you'll see that we have our shells wrapped around our cylinder. And let's just take a look at that. Let's just look around. And what we're looking for is the seam, to make sure that the seam where they meet up is going to be not visible. In this case right now, it is visible. So to fix that, what we can do is we can just go back to our Select Object Size, and we can just make the length just a little bit longer and hit Apply. And we should see that now our seam is missing. There is no seam, so it should be nice and clean along there. So let's close that down. And let's just be sure. Yeah, that looks great. So that's perfect. Okay, let's just go ahead and maximize our 2D view again. We're going to press F on our keyboard to focus in on our job space. And as usual, we should go ahead and try and keep our project as organized as we can. Let's go back to our Modeling tab for a second. And we're going to create a brand new level. And we're going to call this Wrapped Component. and we'll drag our shell molding up into that level. So the next section we're going to create is this piece right here between these two guidelines. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to spiral some 3D clip art all the way around our column 2 times. So that way we'll have a nice little wrap all the way around. Now to do that, if you happen to have vCarve Pro or Aspire, then like I'd mentioned before, you have a gadget in your wrapping section called Spiral Layout, and that will create all the vectors you need for that. But we're going to do it by hand right now. So let's just go ahead and zoom out just a little bit, and we're going to slide over a little bit and a little bit more. That's great. So again, we're going to create a spiral between these two guides, and we want it to wrap around twice. So the first thing we need to do is create a line that is twice as long as the circumference that we have currently. So to do that, we're going to go to our drawing tab, and we're going to select our draw polyline tool, and we're going to drop 1 point here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go over to our form and fill out the rest over here. So we want it to be a 90-degree angle, and we want the length of this to be y times 2. And then if we go equals, we'll get the proper numbers. That's twice around, or twice the circumference of our cylinder. And we can just click add and close. And it's hard to see, but our vector was created. If we hide our guides, we'll see there it is. And it's twice as long as our Y dimension. Let's turn back on our guides again. Now the next thing we want to do is to actually create the line that we're going to spiral our 3D content onto. So again, grab our polyline, and we're going to click down here, and we're going to click up here at the top of that line, and then press escape. And that's great. So let's go find the clip art that we're actually going to put on that line to spiral around our column. So in our clip art tab, in our clip art that comes free with your software, if we go down and look in decorative, and then we just scroll through this clip art, we're going to find a piece of clip art that's going to be perfect for this. It's way down here. It's right here. Flourish 220A. So let's just double click on that, and that will load it into our job. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to go ahead and snap that down here to the bottom corner. Okay, to do this, we're going to go ahead and use our feature called Array Copy, and we're going to click that. Now, I'm not going to do anything with this form right now. I just want to look at it so we know what we're going to do. So we're going to create a row of these, because together as a row they look really nice, and they look really good when they're spiraled around a column. We need to figure out what the distance is, what the gap spacing is between this one and the next one, but the next one needs to tuck underneath this. So how can we go about doing that? Well, if we close this down and we select this again, down here in the corner, this right now, the center of our component is actually set to the 0, 0 of our job. So if we drag this along holding our Alt key down, you'll see that the X dimension is changing, the X location. So we want to line it up where we think it needs to be, and then note that X movement. So it's 4.6, we'll say. That's great. So let's just let go, and we're going to go Control Z and put that back where it was. We're going to go back into our array copy. So what we're going to want to do is create 6 of these, 1 row's worth, and our offset is going to be, we're going to choose offset, not gap. So our offset is going to be 4.6, and we're going to group those together, and we're just going to click copy, and we'll see what happens. And that's great. That's exactly what we wanted. We have 6 of those, and the gap was set right, so we have the same gap between each one, so that looks pretty nice. So let's close that down. Now, our next thing we need to do is we need to rotate this around so that it is at 90 degrees. So if we just press 9 on our keyboard twice, it will rotate that around for us. And then we're going to slide it off to the side for a second. So we're missing a couple pieces of information. One is we need to know how long this line is, and we also need to know what the angle is in here. So to do that, we're going to go over to our dimension tool and click that. And first thing we'll do is we'll get the length. So we'll click down here at the bottom and click at the top, and we can drag out our length. So our length is 17.1971. And then we need to figure out what the angle is. So we're going to use our angle dimension. We're going to click here, here, and then there. And we'll drag out and we'll find out what our dimension is. And it's 24 degrees. Now let's close this down. I just want to point this out to you that there's been a new layer created called dimensions, and it's light gray. That's why you can see these dimensions here, and we can hide them in the end when we don't want them anymore, and we can show them. So now we're going to need to size this up to be 17.1971. So to do that, we're going to go over and use our set selected object size, and we're going to change our height to be 17.1971. And we have our XY linked, so that's going to scale everything down nicely. And we're also going to scale our Z height. Apply that. So now it's the right length, and close. And then what we're going to do is we're going to rotate it. So we're going to select that again. And we're going to go and use our rotate selected objects. And we're going to make it relative to its position right now. Rotate it in its center. And we're going to rotate this minus 24 degrees. Click apply and close. And now that should be at the same angle and be the same length as this line. So if we go ahead and select this, dragging it by the middle point, and we're going to hover over what we think is the middle line, the middle of that line, and it's going to lock that for me and let go. And then if we tile our views, we'll see that our piece of clip art wraps around almost all the way. Now we have to do one more thing to make it wrap around again. If we go to our modeling tab and look at our component tree, we're going to move our flourish onto its own level. So let's go ahead and right click and insert a new level. And we're going to call this spiral component. Press enter. And then we're going to move our flourish up into that level. And then if we right click on the level, we can go down and choose to wrap it. And if you look in the 3D view when I do that, you'll see that it will now continue wrapping around our component. Now that's exactly what I hope to see. So it's wrapping all the way around, and it looks really nice. So let's just go ahead and look back at that in the Z again. And let's maximize our 2D view. Press F on our keyboard to focus in on that. Just before we move on, I want to take a second to point out something that I kind of breezed over a minute ago. The wrapping properties of our levels are important. If we didn't have that turned on, then what would happen is we would only see the components that actually are sitting on our modeling plane. So here you'd only see up to the edge. So, and I can illustrate that if we go to our 3D view for a moment and we unwrap our column, and then we turn off the wrapping properties of our spiral component level, and you'll see that we're only seeing this one row of 3D components. And if we do wrap that one, it won't look quite right. You'll see that it actually stops. So if we look back on our Z again and we unwrap our job and we go back and we turn on our wrapping, then you'll see that it actually gets wrapped around properly. So it's just something to remember, that if you ever do want your components to wrap around your cylinder, then you're going to need to make sure that you use that wrapping properties of your levels feature. Okay, so the next thing I'd like to do is add some raised rings so that we can cover up the ends of our spiraled components here and just make it look a little bit nicer. So to do that, we're going to go over to our clipart tab, and we're going to take a look at our 3D tabs, and we're going to use this guy right here. We're just going to drag him in and drop them down there. Now we are going to zoom in a little bit, and we are going to take that tab and press F9, and then we're going to zoom in a little bit, and we're going to grab the end of it and just plunk it down there. That's great. Now we're going to stretch it up the full length of our job. That looks pretty good. And now we're just going to alter the width of it just a little bit. So if we go to our 3D view, we can see that our relief is pretty thick. It's pretty thick right there now. We don't want it quite that thick. So we should go in before we actually do any more work. Go to our modeling tab and take a look at our component properties. And right now it's 3/4 of an inch tall. If we look at how tall our shell molding is, it's only 1/4 inch, just a little over 1/4 inch. So let's go back to our circular component, and we are going to make it 1/4 inch. Hit the spacebar. And that should be much better now. And actually, we're going to make that even less than that. I think it would look nicer if it was more like 1.15. Let's have a look. Yeah, I think that looks much better there. Perfect. And we'll close that down. And then we want to just widen it up a little bit. So let's zoom in and select that component. And let's go over to our drawing tab. And we're going to change the size of it a little bit. We are going to uncheck the auto scale. And we're going to uncheck the link XY, because all we want to do is just change the width of this to be 0.75 of an inch. And we'll press the space bar and then hit apply. And we'll see that our raised piece now is about the right size. And it actually covers up the end of our reliefs really nice. I think it looks great. But we have the same problem we had before where there's a bit of a seam there. So let's close this down. Now, if we go to our modeling tab, I want to point out that when we dragged that in from our clipart browser, it fell onto our spiral component level, which is a wrapped level, which is not where we want this to be. So we should go ahead and create a brand new level. And we want to rename this level Wrapped Component 2. And we're going to drag that component up to that level. And then we're going to do the same thing that we did with our shell molding, is we need to make it a little bit longer. So let's just select it again, go to our drawing tab. Now we're going to change our height to be a little bit longer. We'll make it 0.7 or 7.9. Let's apply that. Oh, it's getting a little closer. Let's just go all the way to 9.5. And apply that. And there we have, we've sealed up the end of that now, so there isn't any break in that. So let's close that. Now we can also see that in our 3D view, our flourish is riding up on top of our raised bit here. So if we go to our modeling tab and we change our wrapped component to combine mode to be merged, that should fix that problem for us. That looks great. And let's just maximize our 2D view for a second, and let's just zoom out. And now we want to copy this over to this line here so we can cover up the other end. So we're going to select it, hold down our Control and our Alt key and drag across, and it will snap to that line for us. Let go. And if we go ahead and take a look at our 3D view, you'll see that now we have a second line. And that looks pretty good to me. I'm happy with that. Perfect. So let's just go ahead and look back in our Z again and tile our views. We may as well go ahead and hide our dimensions. We don't need those anymore. There we are. It just kind of cleans up our 2D view a bit. Okay, now that we have our layout all done, we're ready to start tooling. So let's pop over to our Toolpaths tab. And as always, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set up our material, or check our material setup. So we'll click that. And the idea of this is to make sure that our settings in our software are the same settings that are physically on our CNC. So we're going to start out with checking the diameter of our material, which is 2.5 inches. Datum is set to the bottom left. We're going to zero off the center of our cylinder. We're going to make sure that our model position is all the way to the top, so no gap at all. And we're going to make sure that we remember this number right here, our model thickness, because we're going to need that later. When we start to create our tooling, we are going to do our 3D roughing and our 3D finishing first, and then we're going to go back in and do our flutes, our coves, and then our tabs. So we're going to remove a lot of the material beforehand, but we need to know what the thickness is of our model. So 0.2547. We're going to make sure that our rapid Z gaps and our home and start position are safe for our machine, taking into account any kind of hold downs or anything that might be in the way of our material. And then we can just click OK. Our first toolpath is going to be our 3D roughing pass. So let's just go ahead and click that. We're going to select a tool from our tool database, and it's going to be the 1/4 inch end mill. We're going to select that, and those settings are safe and appropriate for our machine. We're going to use a model boundary to be our machining limit. We don't want any boundary offset. We're going to leave 0.03 of an inch of material, just so that we won't chip our material with our roughing pass, and also we have some material to remove with our finishing pass. We're going to use Z-level roughing, profile last. We're going to do order level by level, and we're going to go along the X. We don't need any ramp plunge moves, and we're just going to rename this with an indication of our tool at the end, and let's calculate that up. Now, of course, we're going to want to preview this just to make sure everything looks okay. So let's preview our visible toolpath, and as you saw, it previewed that as a flat relief, and then it's wrapped it around our cylinder. And that looks like exactly what I expected to see. So that's perfect. Let's look back down on our Z. Let's close this. Let's go on to our 3D finishing pass. We're going to select a new tool. In this case, it's going to be a 1/8 inch ball nose end mill. And those settings are safe and appropriate for me. So let's select that. No boundary offset. We are going to use a raster. And we're going to raster at 0 degrees. So it's going to go up and down our column and cut that, and we're going to call that finish. Let's delete that, and we're going to put in a 0.125 ball nose end mill, and we'll calculate that. Oh, and I forgot to tell it that I want to use my model boundary, so let's just calculate that. This is going to take a little bit longer to calculate. It's of course a much denser toolpath using a smaller tool. So once it gets all calculated, we'll take a look and we'll preview that to make sure everything looks good. Now again, if our tooling preview doesn't look right in the software, then we should go ahead and make any adjustments that are needed. If it doesn't look right in our software, then there's a pretty good chance it's not going to look right when we cut it on our machine. Let's just go ahead and preview that. Oh, that looks really good. I'm happy with that. Okay, let's look back down on our Z again. Let's close that. Now our next thing we're going to do is we're going to work on our fluting. So let's just select our vectors that we made for our fluting, and we're going to go and choose to create a fluting toolpath. We're going to have a start depth. Now the start depth, because we've removed the material, the 0.2547, then we're going to want to make sure that we put that in here, because we don't want it to cut on the surface of our material because it's not there anymore. We want to actually cut right on what's left over after our finishing pass. Our flute depth is going to be 0.125. We're going to select a tool, and our tool is going to be a 1/2 inch ball nose end mill. Select that. We're going to ramp at the start and end, and our ramp length is going to be a 1/2 inch. We're going to make sure that we have a smooth ramp type, and we're going to calculate that. And let's preview that toolpath. And that looks exactly like what I was hoping it was going to look like, so I'm happy with that. Let's close that down. Now, when I created that toolpath, I forgot to actually rename it properly. So let's go back into that again, and let's just rename that so that we can remember what tool we use for that. And we'll recalculate that, and everything should be the same. So we don't need to re-preview it because we know it's the same toolpath. Let's close that down. Now our next toolpath is going to be for our coves. So that is going to be a profile cut. And again, we're going to have a start depth of 0.2547. And we are going to cut a depth of 0.1 of an inch. And we are going to use a 1/2 inch ball nose. And we'll go ahead and select that. And we're going to go on the lines. Now we didn't select our lines, so let's just go ahead and select those lines that we need. These lines here are going to be our actual cove molding lines. We're not going to do any last passes. We don't need to add any tabs in. We're just going to go ahead and profile that, and let's call that coves. And we'll put in here 0.5 ball nose end mill. Let's calculate that. Then we'll preview that. That looks great. Love the way that looks. That's perfect. So let's close that down. And then for our last toolpath, we're actually going to cut the tabs. So this will make it easier for us to remove it. Once we pop our material off our machine, we'll know exactly where to cut. So to do that, we're going to use a profile cut again, but we're going to select these outside vectors. And we're going to start at the 0.2547 again. If we hadn't have removed that material, we wanted it to go down a 1/2 inch. But because we did remove material, we want to subtract away from that the depth that we went down, which was the 0.2547, and we press equals. The distance or the depth that's here now is the actual depth that we want it to go down after we've already gone down the 0.2547. So that's perfect. We're going to select the tool. We're going to go ahead and select our 1/2 inch end mill. Select that. This time we're going to go on the line, and we are going to do no separate last pass. We don't need any tabs because these will be our tabs. No ramp moves. We're going to call this profile. Tabs 0.5 end mill. We can calculate that. Then we'll preview that. And that is exactly what we wanted to see happen. And that all looks good. It's perfect. Okay, now that we've done our tooling and we're happy with the actual toolpath preview, then we can go ahead and save off our tooling. And now we can go ahead and save off our finished project. We'll call it column.crv. Save that. And yes, we're going to replace that. And now with that, that concludes this demonstration. I hope you enjoyed that. And now that you have the file, you can go ahead and edit this and make it your own.